The biggest deals in the world are rarely lost because of money. Sometimes, they disappear because no one understands a single line of ink. The lunch crowd at the Alder Room moved with the quiet rhythm that only Manhattan could create, where polished shoes crossed marble floors, crystal glasses caught the afternoon light, and conversations worth millions of dollars blended into the soft notes of a grand piano tucked beside the windows. Every table seemed occupied by someone discussing acquisitions, investments, or expansion plans, yet among the tailored suits and luxury watches, almost no one noticed the young waitress carrying a silver tray with calm, practiced confidence. Claire Bennett had learned long ago that people rarely remembered the person who refilled their water glasses. They remembered the meal, the meeting, the deal, but almost never the waitress who silently made everything run on time. She preferred it that way. Invisible people heard everything. Every morning before sunrise, Claire left the small apartment she shared with her aging father in Queens, carrying a worn canvas tote that held two things she never left behind: a paperback book and a simple fountain pen with a dark walnut handle. The pen had belonged to her grandfather, who had spent decades teaching East Asian calligraphy before arthritis forced him to put it away forever. Claire still polished it every Sunday evening, not because it was valuable, but because it reminded her that careful hands often revealed careful minds. By 11:30, the restaurant had transformed into a theater of ambition. Executives filled every booth. Attorneys reviewed contracts over espresso. Venture capitalists debated numbers while barely touching their expensive lunches. Claire moved between tables with effortless precision, remembering preferences before guests spoke them, offering warm bread exactly when conversations paused, never interrupting a negotiation, yet somehow always arriving at the perfect moment. Her coworkers often joked that she could predict people's thoughts simply by watching their eyes. She laughed with them, never explaining that years of studying languages had taught her something more important than vocabulary. Every culture revealed itself long before anyone opened their mouth. At precisely 12:15, the front entrance opened, and the quiet balance of the dining room shifted almost instantly. Ethan Caldwell entered without rushing, though the space around him seemed to move faster the moment he appeared. At 39, the billionaire technology founder had become one of the youngest executives ever to lead a Fortune 500 company after transforming a modest software startup into a global artificial intelligence empire. Financial magazines admired his discipline. Business schools analyzed his negotiations. Employees respected his relentless standards. Critics often described him with a single word: intimidating. He acknowledged the hostess with a courteous nod before taking his reserved corner table overlooking Park Avenue. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his silver watch understated rather than flashy, and his expression suggested someone whose calendar had no room for wasted minutes. Claire approached carrying a leather-bound menu. "Good afternoon, Mr. Caldwell. Welcome back." Ethan barely glanced up from the documents spread across the table. "Thank you." His voice was polite but distant, already occupied by numbers and deadlines. Claire poured sparkling water into his glass with steady hands before quietly stepping away. There was nothing unusual about the exchange. It happened every few weeks. He came for meetings. She served lunch. Neither expected the other to become part of the day. 20 minutes later, another guest arrived. Unlike Ethan, the elderly gentleman entered without an entourage or announcement. His charcoal jacket looked decades old, though perfectly maintained, and under one arm rested a slim leather portfolio that appeared older than many people in the restaurant. The hostess greeted him with unusual respect before leading him directly to Ethan's table. They shook hands warmly. Claire noticed something curious. Instead of immediately discussing contracts, the older man smiled, reached into his portfolio, removed an ordinary white dinner napkin, and laid it gently between them. Then, taking out a brush pen instead of a ballpoint, he wrote several elegant rows of remarkably complex characters across the napkin. They flowed like tiny works of art rather than ordinary writing, each stroke deliberate, balanced, and impossibly graceful. When he finished, he folded the pen, slid the napkin across the table, and simply said, "If you understand this, you'll understand why our families have done business for generations." Ethan lowered his eyes to the napkin. His confident expression remained unchanged for only a second before the smallest crease formed between his eyebrows. He turned the napkin slightly. Then again. Around the table, two senior advisors leaned closer. One quietly admitted he had never seen writing quite like it. Another reached for his phone before stopping himself. For the first time that afternoon, silence settled over the meeting. The restaurant continued buzzing around them. Plates clinked softly, coffee steamed from porcelain cups, and conversations drifted through the room. But inside that small circle near the window, everything had stopped. Ethan Caldwell, a man accustomed to solving impossible problems, stared at a simple paper napkin as though it had become the only object in the world that refused to answer him. Ethan did not touch the napkin again for several long seconds. He simply studied it with the quiet determination that had built companies and convinced investors to follow impossible ideas. Numbers had always surrendered to logic. Markets eventually revealed patterns. Even people, he believed, became predictable if someone observed them long enough. But the graceful characters resting on the white paper refused to become familiar. They did not resemble anything he had encountered during years of international negotiations. They looked less like language and more like carefully balanced pieces of art. Across the table, the elderly gentleman watched without impatience. There was no hint of superiority in his calm smile, only quiet curiosity, as though he had already accepted that the next few minutes would reveal something far more valuable than the outcome of a business meeting. Ethan finally looked up. I recognize a few traditional forms, but I cannot honestly say I understand what I am looking at. The older man nodded gently, almost approvingly. Many people pretend they understand. Very few choose honesty first. One of Ethan's legal advisors cleared his throat. We can contact our language consultants immediately. Another executive had already opened a translation application on his phone, pointing the camera toward the napkin. The software hesitated, highlighted several symbols, then displayed a string of meaningless words that barely resembled a sentence. The advisor frowned. That cannot be correct. Another application produced a completely different answer. A third simply reported that the writing could not be recognized. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Technology had failed him before, but rarely this quickly. He glanced through the dining room almost absent-mindedly, noticing conversations continuing as though nothing unusual had happened. Nearby, a young couple celebrated an anniversary with shared dessert. Two attorneys quietly reviewed documents beside the windows. A father showed his little son how to fold a paper napkin into the shape of a sailboat. Life continued with ordinary comfort, while one small piece of paper quietly refused to cooperate. Not far away, Claire carried fresh coffee toward another table. She noticed the unusual silence surrounding Ethan's meeting, but kept walking. Experience had taught her never to interrupt private business discussions, especially those involving high-profile guests. Still, as she placed coffee before an elderly regular near the fireplace, her eyes briefly drifted toward the handwritten napkin. Only for an instant. Then she looked away and continued serving lunch exactly as she always did. The restaurant manager approached Ethan's table with careful professionalism. Is everything satisfactory this afternoon, Mr. Caldwell? Ethan offered a polite smile. Everything is excellent. We are simply trying to understand something. The manager followed his gaze toward the napkin without asking another question. Please let us know if there is anything our staff can do. Thank you, Ethan replied. I appreciate that. The manager nodded and quietly walked away. In the service station behind the dining room, Claire carefully organized clean silverware while another waitress, Megan, lowered her voice. Table 12 looks unusually tense. Claire smiled faintly. Business lunches sometimes become complicated. You always sound so calm. Megan laughed. If billionaires looked that serious at my table, I would probably forget how to carry a tray. Claire shook her head gently. Most people are not upset with you. They are carrying something long before they walk through the door. Megan smiled, not fully understanding what Claire meant, but somehow feeling comforted anyway. Claire returned to polishing wine glasses. She had always believed restaurants revealed people exactly as they were. Some celebrated promotions. Some apologized after years apart. Some quietly ended partnerships. Others signed contracts that changed hundreds of lives. Every table carried a different story, and every story deserved the same respect, whether the bill totaled $20 or $2,000. Back at Ethan's table, The elderly gentleman slowly folded his hands. May I ask you a question? Ethan nodded. Of course. When you interview new employees, what do you look at first? Ethan answered without hesitation. Character. Skills can be taught. Integrity cannot. The older man smiled again. Interesting. He gently tapped the folded napkin with one finger. Sometimes character is also the only key that opens knowledge. Ethan considered the words, but found no immediate meaning. Before he could respond, Claire approached carrying a fresh pot of hot tea requested earlier by another guest seated beside their table. She poured quietly, thanked the customer with a warm smile, and turned to leave. As she passed Ethan's chair, the edge of the folded napkin caught her attention once more. This time, one small detail made her steps slow almost imperceptibly. It was not the elegant characters themselves. It was the direction of the brush strokes. Her eyes rested there for less than a heartbeat before she continued walking, though somewhere deep inside her memory, an old lesson from her grandfather quietly awakened. Claire reached the service station before allowing herself one quiet glance back toward the corner table. The elderly guest had not touched his teacup. Ethan Caldwell remained focused on the folded napkin, his advisors whispering possibilities that dissolved almost as quickly as they were spoken. Something about the scene felt strangely familiar, not because she recognized either man, but because she had seen that exact expression before. It was the look her grandfather wore whenever one of his students stared only at the ink instead of the intention behind it. Claire carefully placed the empty coffee pot beneath the counter and inhaled slowly. She reminded herself that the conversation had nothing to do with her. She was here to serve lunch, not solve mysteries that belonged to distinguished guests. Even so, the image refused to leave her mind. The final character on the napkin leaned ever so slightly to the left, a deliberate choice almost invisible to anyone unfamiliar with traditional brush writing. That single detail changed everything. It suggested the writer wanted the reader to abandon literal translation altogether. Behind the bar, the restaurant manager looked toward the dining room. Claire, could you take fresh sparkling water to table 7? Of course, she answered without hesitation. She picked up a chilled glass bottle, 2 crystal glasses, and walked calmly toward Ethan's meeting. Every step felt ordinary. Every movement remained measured. She did not rehearse words because she had no intention of speaking. She simply intended to refill their glasses and continue with the afternoon. As she reached the table, Ethan finally looked away from the napkin long enough to acknowledge her with a polite nod. Thank you. Claire smiled warmly and began pouring sparkling water into the nearest glass. The room remained quiet. Even the elderly gentleman seemed content to let the silence continue. Then Ethan sighed almost imperceptibly. It was not frustration directed at anyone else. It sounded more like disappointment in himself. I dislike leaving questions unanswered, he admitted softly, especially when I know the answer is somewhere in front of me. The older man responded with gentle kindness. Sometimes answers do not hide. Sometimes they simply wait for different eyes. Claire's hand paused for the briefest fraction of a second as those words settled over the table. Different eyes. She finished pouring the water and placed the bottle carefully beside Ethan's glass. She could have walked away. In fact, every rule of professionalism suggested that she should. But something deeper than curiosity held her there for one respectful heartbeat longer. She looked toward the elderly gentleman before speaking with remarkable humility. Please forgive me if I am mistaken. Every head at the table turned toward her. Claire kept her voice soft, never raising it above the quiet atmosphere of the restaurant. May I ask one question about the writing? Ethan blinked with visible surprise. One of his advisors looked uncertain, clearly wondering why a waitress had entered a conversation involving international business. The elderly gentleman, however, smiled almost immediately. Of course. Claire looked at the napkin without reaching toward it. Were those characters written to be read, or to be understood? For the first time since entering the restaurant, the elderly man's eyes brightened with unmistakable delight. He laughed quietly, not at anyone in the room, but with genuine appreciation. That, he said warmly, is exactly the first question someone should ask. Ethan stared first at the gentleman, then at Claire. What does that mean? The older man folded his hands comfortably. It means your waitress has already noticed something every consultant before her has missed. The advisors exchanged confused glances. Claire immediately lowered her eyes. I apologize if I spoke out of turn. Not at all. The gentleman replied. Please, stay for just a moment. Claire hesitated. Every instinct told her to return to work, yet the kindness in his voice carried no trace of authority or expectation. It sounded like a teacher recognizing another student. Ethan studied Claire more carefully than he had at any previous visit. Until now, she had simply been the attentive waitress who remembered sparkling water without asking, and always seemed to appear exactly when needed. He suddenly realized he had never actually looked beyond her uniform. There was nothing dramatic about her appearance. No attempt to attract attention. Her calm expression carried the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to prove anything. She stood with relaxed shoulders, both hands gently folded in front of her apron, waiting patiently as though silence itself had become part of her vocabulary. Ethan spoke carefully. You recognize something from only a brief glance. Claire answered with complete honesty. Not the meaning, only the intention. The elderly gentleman nodded approvingly. An important distinction. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, removed a beautifully crafted fountain pen with a polished black barrel, and placed it gently beside the folded napkin. Very well, he said with a peaceful smile. Let us see whether intention can become understanding. Claire looked at the fountain pen without moving. The polished black barrel reflected the afternoon sunlight spilling through the restaurant windows, and for an instant she was no longer standing inside one of Manhattan's finest dining rooms. She was 10 years old again, sitting beside her grandfather at a worn wooden table as he patiently reminded her that every stroke carried intention before beauty. Never rush a brush, he used to say. People who hurry only copy words. People who slow down discover meaning. She returned to the present with a quiet breath. Sir, she said gently, I should not interrupt your meeting. Ethan answered before the elderly gentleman could speak. You already have our attention. Please continue. His voice was different now. The distance that had colored every previous conversation had softened into genuine curiosity. Claire carefully reached for the fountain pen, but did not uncap it immediately. Instead, she picked up the folded napkin with both hands, studying it respectfully rather than possessively. She did not stare only at the characters. She examined the spacing between them, the angle of each line, the pressure left behind by the brush, even the tiny pauses where the ink became slightly darker. The elderly gentleman watched with quiet satisfaction. One of Ethan's advisors leaned closer, fascinated despite himself. Another lowered his phone completely, accepting that no application could explain what Claire seemed to notice naturally. After nearly half a minute, Claire smiled almost imperceptibly. The writing is beautiful, she whispered. But the message is not actually inside these characters. Ethan frowned. Then where is it? Claire looked up. Inside the order they ask us to think. The table fell silent again. She uncapped the fountain pen with slow, careful movements and asked politely, May I add one small mark? The elderly gentleman nodded immediately. Please do. Claire did not erase anything. She did not rewrite a single character. Instead, she drew one short guiding stroke in an empty space beside the final symbol, no longer than half an inch. The movement lasted barely 2 seconds. Then she placed the pen back on the table exactly where she had found it. Nothing dramatic appeared to have changed. Ethan looked down with visible confusion. That tiny line changes everything. Claire nodded softly. Not the words. The direction. She turned the napkin 90 degrees clockwise. Suddenly, the elegant characters no longer appeared to stand independently. They flowed together as one continuous thought. The empty spaces formed invisible connections that had been impossible to notice before. Ethan instinctively leaned closer. Claire spoke calmly, never sounding eager to impress anyone. Many traditional calligraphers believe that blank space carries as much meaning as ink. If someone reads only the visible symbols, they miss half the conversation. The elderly gentleman smiled broadly. Excellent. Claire continued. This was never intended to be translated word for word. It is meant to ask whether the reader understands balance before language. Ethan studied the arrangement again. For the first time, he noticed the rhythm she described. Every character seemed positioned to guide the eye rather than simply deliver information. It resembled architecture as much as writing. So what does it actually say? He asked quietly. Claire folded her hands before answering. The closest English meaning would be, the person who seeks only answers will eventually become lost. The person who learns how to ask will always find the path. No one spoke. Even nearby conversations seemed to fade into the background as those words settled gently across the table. Ethan repeated the sentence under his breath, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it felt unexpectedly personal. The elderly gentleman finally lifted his teacup. That is close enough to satisfy even my old teacher. Ethan looked at him with surprise. You expected someone to recognize this? The gentleman chuckled softly. I expected someone to notice what could not be translated. I simply did not know that person would be wearing a waitress apron. Claire immediately shook her head. Please do not give me too much credit. My grandfather spent years teaching me that language belongs to everyone willing to respect it. I only remembered one lesson at the right moment. Ethan's advisors exchanged thoughtful glances. None of them appeared embarrassed. Instead, they seemed strangely relieved, as though they had just witnessed a reminder that expertise sometimes appeared in the least expected places. Ethan looked at Claire again, but this time he was not seeing a server carrying trays through a dining room. He was seeing someone whose quiet confidence had come from years of discipline rather than recognition. And for the first time that afternoon, the billionaire realized the most valuable person in the room had never been sitting at the negotiation table. The elderly gentleman carefully folded the napkin once again, but this time his movements carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just confirmed a long-held belief. He slid the paper toward Ethan instead of placing it back inside his portfolio. Keep it, he said warmly. Not because of what it says, but because of what it taught before anyone explained it. Ethan rested his fingertips lightly on the folded napkin. During years of negotiations, he had signed contracts worth billions of dollars without his pulse changing. Yet this simple piece of paper somehow felt heavier than every agreement he had ever carried. He looked toward Claire. Would you sit with us for just a few minutes? Claire's eyes widened slightly. I appreciate the invitation, but I am working. Before Ethan could respond, the restaurant manager approached after noticing the conversation had become unusually personal. Is everything all right here? Ethan stood politely. More than all right. Your waitress has just helped us understand something no one else could. The manager looked at Claire with surprise before smiling. If you need 5 minutes, Claire, I can cover your section. Claire hesitated. She disliked becoming the center of attention, but refusing genuine kindness felt equally wrong. Thank you, she answered quietly before taking the empty chair nearest the window. She sat with perfect posture, her apron still neatly tied, her hands resting comfortably in her lap, as though she had simply paused between tables instead of joining a conversation that moments earlier had seemed far beyond her place. The elderly gentleman poured tea into a fresh cup and placed it gently before her. My name is Kenji Sato, he said. I realize we have not properly introduced ourselves. Claire smiled. It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sato. Ethan nodded as well. I should correct my own mistake. We have crossed paths several times, but I never actually introduced myself. Ethan Caldwell. Claire laughed softly. I know, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan smiled for the first time that afternoon. Of course you do. I have apparently been far less observant than I imagined. The comment drew quiet laughter from everyone at the table. The tension that had surrounded the meeting slowly disappeared, replaced by something much rarer in business settings. Genuine conversation. Kenji lifted his teacup. Tell me, Claire, where did you learn to see writing this way? She looked out the window for a brief moment, watching yellow taxis roll steadily down Park Avenue before answering. From my grandfather. He believed that every language reflects the heart of the people who created it. He never wanted me to memorize symbols. He wanted me to understand why they existed. Ethan, listen without interrupting. Was he a professor? Claire shook her head gently. No. He taught wherever people were willing to learn. Sometimes in schools. Sometimes in libraries. Sometimes at our own kitchen table. And you continued studying? Kenji asked. Claire nodded. For many years. Her smile remained warm, though something quieter settled behind her eyes. Life eventually became different. She offered nothing more. She did not mention hospital appointments. She did not mention long nights caring for her father after her grandfather passed away. She did not describe scholarship opportunities quietly set aside because family needed her more than classrooms did. Some stories, she believed, earned greater dignity when left simple. Ethan noticed the pause but respected it. Instead of asking what had happened, he asked something else. Do you still study? Claire smiled again, this time with unmistakable sincerity. Every day. Ethan looked surprised. Even while working here? Especially while working here. She glanced around the restaurant. People speak many languages without realizing it. Gratitude has one. Pride has another. Loneliness has one too. If you pay attention long enough, you begin hearing all of them. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. The answer lingered with him far longer than he expected. Throughout his career, he had evaluated employees by resumes, performance reviews, presentations, and measurable results. Claire had just described an entirely different form of intelligence, one that could not be listed beneath professional certifications or university degrees. Kenji looked toward Ethan with a knowing smile. Now you understand why I brought the napkin instead of a contract. Ethan nodded slowly. You were never testing whether I could translate the writing. No. Kenji's eyes reflected decades of quiet wisdom. I was learning whether the person leading a company valued knowledge wherever it appeared. Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment before looking directly at Claire. Then today I have learned something as well. Claire tilted her head slightly. What is that? Ethan answered with complete honesty. That I have spent years searching for exceptional people in exceptional places. I never stopped to consider that extraordinary character might be standing beside my table every time I ordered lunch. For several quiet moments, no one at the table felt the need to fill the silence. Outside, Manhattan continued moving at its usual relentless pace. Buses rolled past the avenue. Office workers hurried along the sidewalks with paper coffee cups in hand. Inside the Alder room, however, time seemed to slow just enough for everyone at the table to notice something they had overlooked for years. Ethan carefully folded the napkin once more and slipped it inside the leather portfolio that contained the day's contracts. He placed it in a separate pocket, away from financial documents and legal agreements, almost instinctively treating it as something that deserved its own place. Claire noticed the gesture, but said nothing. She simply lifted her teacup and thanked Kenji with a grateful smile. Ethan finally broke the silence. Claire, may I ask you something personal? She nodded gently. If I am comfortable answering, of course. Why are you working here? The question carried no judgment now, only honest curiosity. Claire looked toward the large windows where sunlight reflected across neighboring buildings. Because it is honest work. Ethan smiled faintly. That explains why you stay. It does not explain how you arrived. Claire considered the question before answering. Sometimes life changes direction before we are ready. She spoke without sadness, only acceptance. I planned to continue studying languages full-time. Then my grandfather became ill. After he passed away, my father needed more help than he was willing to admit. Bills arrived whether dreams were ready or not. So I found work, and this restaurant became home. Ethan listened carefully. Did you ever regret it? Claire answered almost immediately. Not once. The speed of her reply surprised everyone. She continued with quiet confidence. I miss classrooms sometimes. I miss old libraries. But I never regret taking care of the people who first taught me how to care for others. Kenji lowered his eyes with visible respect. Your grandfather would have been proud. Claire smiled softly. I hope so. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You speak about him often. Because he still teaches me. Ethan looked puzzled. Claire gently touched the walnut fountain pen resting on the table. Every morning before work, I write one page by hand. Sometimes poetry, sometimes history, sometimes only a single sentence. He believed that if your hands stop practicing, your mind slowly begins accepting shortcuts. Ethan laughed quietly. That sounds like advice every business leader should hear. Claire returned the smile. Perhaps every person should. One of Ethan's senior advisors, David Reynolds, who had remained mostly silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. Forgive my curiosity, Miss Bennett, but with your knowledge, have you never considered becoming a consultant or a translator? Claire looked at him kindly. Many people imagine knowledge exists only inside impressive job titles. I have met brilliant mechanics, thoughtful nurses, wise school custodians, remarkable waitresses, and retired mail carriers who could explain history better than university professors. Work tells us what someone does. It rarely tells us who they are. David slowly nodded. No one challenged her answer because everyone at the table sensed its truth. Ethan found himself remembering dozens of interviews over the years. How many capable people had he quietly dismissed because their resumes lacked prestigious positions? How many conversations had he ended before discovering the person sitting across from him? The realization felt surprisingly uncomfortable. Kenji watched Ethan with a gentle expression. Leadership becomes easier when curiosity becomes stronger than assumption. Ethan smiled thoughtfully. I suspect I have been assuming far more than I realized. At that moment, the restaurant manager approached again, this time carrying a small leather check presenter. Please forgive the interruption. He looked toward Ethan. Whenever you are ready. Ethan accepted it with appreciation before closing it without opening the bill. Instead, he looked at Claire. Would you return to your shift after this conversation? Claire nodded. Of course. My tables have been very patient today. Good, Ethan replied. Because they deserve the same excellent service you have given every other guest. Claire stood slowly from her chair. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your afternoon. Kenji rose as well and offered a respectful bow of his head instead of a handshake. Claire returned the gesture naturally, understanding the courtesy without hesitation. Ethan noticed even that small exchange. Nothing Claire did appeared rehearsed. Every action reflected years of quiet learning rather than occasional performance. As she picked up the empty teacups and gathered them neatly onto her serving tray, she once again became simply another waitress moving gracefully through the dining room. Within seconds, she was greeting another table with the same warm smile she had offered every customer that afternoon, never mentioning the remarkable conversation she had just shared. Ethan watched her disappear into the gentle rhythm of the restaurant before speaking almost to himself. The extraordinary part is not that she knew the answer. He paused, still following Claire with his eyes as she helped an elderly couple choose dessert. The extraordinary part is that she never needed anyone to know she knew it. The afternoon meeting concluded without the usual rush that accompanied billion-dollar negotiations. Contracts, thoughts. Finally, David Reynolds spoke. Should I arrange another meeting with Mr. Sato next month? Ethan looked toward the restaurant floor where Claire was carefully helping a young family settle their bill while patiently answering questions from their curious little daughter about the restaurant's desserts. Yes, Ethan replied. And before that, I would like you to change something inside our hiring process. David looked surprised. What exactly? Ethan folded his hands. Remove the first page of every applicant's resume before interviews. The first page? Names of universities, former job titles, prestigious companies. I want managers to meet people before they meet credentials. David blinked. That is unusual. Ethan smiled thoughtfully. So was today. Across the dining room, Claire thanked the family for visiting before carrying their empty plates toward the kitchen. Her afternoon continued exactly as every other shift had. She recommended soup to an elderly gentleman who appreciated lighter meals. She quietly replaced a child's spilled lemonade before anyone felt embarrassed. She congratulated a young couple celebrating their first anniversary after overhearing a whispered conversation. None of her kindness depended on who occupied the table. Every guest received the same patience, the same warm smile, and the same careful attention. Near the end of the lunch service, the restaurant manager stopped beside her as she polished silverware. Claire, she looked up. Yes. I have managed restaurants for nearly 20 years. He smiled warmly. I have never seen one of our guests thank a waitress the way Mr. Caldwell thanked you today. Claire continued polishing the fork in her hand. He was very kind. Do you know who he is? Claire laughed softly. I know enough to understand he is an important businessman. The manager smiled. Most people would have asked for a photograph. Claire shook her head. I already have something better than a photograph. What is that? She carefully placed the polished fork beside the others. A good conversation. The manager looked at her for a moment before quietly nodding and walking away. Later that afternoon, Ethan settled the bill before standing near the entrance instead of leaving immediately. Several employees wished him a pleasant afternoon as they passed. Finally, Claire approached carrying his coat, which had been placed neatly on the restaurant stand beside the door. Here you are, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan accepted it with a grateful smile. Thank you, Claire. She handed him the folded napkin as well. You almost forgot this. Ethan looked down at it for a long second before carefully placing it inside his jacket pocket. I do not think I will ever forget it. Claire smiled. I hope it reminds you of a pleasant lunch. Ethan gently shook his head. It will remind me of a lesson. He reached into his wallet, removed a business card, and held it toward her. Claire glanced at the card but did not immediately take it. There is no obligation, Ethan said kindly. This is not a job offer. She accepted the card politely. Then what is it? My direct number. Claire looked puzzled. Ethan continued. If you ever need access to our company library, language archives, or research collections, call me. You do not have to work for my company to use knowledge that should be shared. Claire looked genuinely surprised. It was not an offer of money. It was not an attempt to change her life overnight. It was simply an open door. That is incredibly generous, she said quietly. Ethan smiled. Not generous. He looked briefly toward the dining room, where dozens of ordinary conversations continued beneath warm afternoon light. Consider it repayment for reminding me that education is not measured by where someone works. Claire slipped the card carefully into the small notebook she carried inside her apron pocket beside grocery lists, family reminders, and favorite quotations copied by hand over the years. Then I will accept it with gratitude. Ethan nodded once before stepping outside into the bright Manhattan afternoon. As the revolving door slowly turned behind him, he glanced back through the glass. Claire was already returning to another table, greeting new guests with exactly the same quiet smile she had worn before either of them realized that the most important lesson of the day had nothing to do with business at all. The following Monday arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn. Manhattan awakened beneath pale blue skies as commuters hurried through subway stations, delivery trucks filled narrow streets, and coffee shops welcomed the familiar morning rush. Inside the headquarters of Caldwell Technologies, however, one unusual change quietly spread through the building before most employees had even finished their first cup of coffee. Every hiring manager received a simple email from Ethan Caldwell himself. It contained only one sentence. Meet the person before you meet the resume. No lengthy explanation followed. No corporate presentation appeared. No motivational speech accompanied the instruction. Yet everyone knew that when Ethan changed a policy personally, he expected people to understand that something important had shifted. David Reynolds stood outside Ethan's office carrying a folder of interview schedules. Human Resources has questions, he admitted with a cautious smile. Ethan looked up from his desk. The folded napkin rested inside a small glass frame beside his computer, replacing the expensive award that had occupied the space for years. I expected that. David glanced toward the framed napkin. May I ask why you placed it there? Ethan followed his gaze. Because success leaves trophies. Wisdom leaves reminders. David nodded slowly. He no longer found Ethan's changes unusual. He had watched the transformation begin one quiet afternoon over lunch, and now he could see it reaching every corner of the company. Across the city, Claire's week looked almost identical to every week before it. She caught the 7:15 train from Queens. She stopped at the neighborhood bakery where the owner always saved a warm cinnamon roll for her father. She arrived at the Alder Room 15 minutes early, tied her apron carefully, greeted her coworkers by name, and began another day of welcoming strangers with the same calm kindness she offered everyone. Nothing about her routine suggested she had recently influenced one of the most successful executives in the country. She never mentioned the conversation unless someone asked directly, and even then she described it simply as an interesting afternoon. During her lunch break, she opened the small notebook she always carried. Ethan's business card remained tucked neatly between handwritten quotations copied over the years. She looked at it for a moment before closing the notebook again. She had no intention of calling, not because she doubted his sincerity, but because she believed opportunities should arrive naturally rather than be chased through personal connections. If she ever stepped into a different chapter of life, she wanted to arrive there through preparation rather than privilege. That evening, after her shift ended, Claire returned home to the modest brick apartment where her father waited beside the kitchen window reading an old hardcover history book. His silver hair reflected the warm kitchen light as he smiled the moment she walked through the door. Long day, he asked. Claire laughed softly while placing the bakery bag on the table. Busy but good. He noticed the thoughtful expression she had been carrying all evening. Something happened. Claire poured 2 cups of chamomile tea before sitting across from him. She told him about the businessman, the handwritten napkin, the elderly teacher, and the unexpected conversation that followed. She described everything except the praise directed toward her. Her father listened quietly until she finished. Then he smiled in the same gentle way her grandfather once had. Did you help because he was wealthy? No. Would you have explained the writing to anyone who sincerely wanted to understand? Claire nodded immediately. Of course. He lifted his teacup. Then you honored your grandfather perfectly. Claire lowered her eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I have accomplished enough. Her father reached across the table and lightly rested his hand over hers. Claire, the world measures accomplishment by applause. Your grandfather measured it by usefulness. Those are very different things. His words settled gently into the quiet room. Claire looked toward the old walnut fountain pen resting beside a stack of books on the shelf. It suddenly occurred to her that the pen had never cared whether it wrote inside a university classroom or at a small kitchen table. It fulfilled its purpose wherever someone chose to learn. The following afternoon, a delivery arrived at the Alder room addressed simply to Claire Bennett. Her co-workers gathered around curiously as she opened the carefully wrapped package. Inside rested a beautiful handmade journal bound in dark blue leather. There was no company logo, no expensive branding, only a small handwritten note tucked inside the first page. It read, "Thank you for reminding me that the finest teachers often introduce themselves without titles. May every page ahead hold another lesson worth sharing. With gratitude, Ethan Caldwell." Claire smiled quietly before closing the journal with both hands. She did not see it as a reward. She saw it as an invitation to continue becoming the person her grandfather had always believed she already was. 3 months passed almost unnoticed, yet small changes quietly continued spreading in places neither Claire nor Ethan could have predicted. At Caldwell Technologies, interview panels no longer saw names of prestigious universities before meeting candidates. Managers began listening longer, asking better questions, and discovering remarkable people whose stories had once been hidden beneath ordinary resumes. Human resources noticed something unexpected. Employee retention improved. Team satisfaction increased. Collaboration became easier. The company had not become more successful because it hired more impressive credentials. It had become stronger because it learned to recognize character before reputation. On a cool Friday afternoon, Ethan returned to the Alder room without an appointment, without advisors, and without a business meeting waiting upstairs. He requested the same quiet table beside the window, ordered a simple bowl of soup and fresh bread, and spent most of the meal reading a hardcover history book instead of reviewing financial reports. Several employees noticed the difference. The billionaire who once measured afternoons by meetings now seemed perfectly content, allowing an ordinary lunch to remain ordinary. Claire recognized him the moment he entered, yet greeted him exactly as she greeted every other guest. "Welcome back, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Claire." There was no ceremony between them, no dramatic reunion, only the comfortable familiarity that sometimes grows between people who have shared one meaningful conversation. After finishing his meal, Ethan asked for the check. Claire placed the leather presenter on the table and thanked him sincerely for visiting. As she turned to leave, Ethan spoke softly. "Would you join me for 1 minute before your next table?" Claire looked toward the dining room. Another waitress had already stepped in to refill nearby coffee cups. She nodded and returned to the chair across from him. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded napkin. Though carefully preserved inside a protective sleeve, the ink looked exactly as it had that first afternoon. He smiled as he placed it gently on the table. "It still travels with me." Claire laughed quietly. "I had a feeling it might." Ethan looked toward the bustling restaurant. "Do you know something interesting?" Claire tilted her head. "What is that?" "Whenever I look at this napkin now, I no longer think about the writing." "What do you think about?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "The person who reminded me that wisdom often enters a room wearing ordinary clothes." Claire lowered her eyes modestly. "My grandfather would tell you that wisdom belongs to anyone willing to keep learning." Ethan smiled. "Then perhaps I finally became a student." They shared a brief silence while afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished wooden table. Around them, life continued with its familiar rhythm. Glasses clinked softly. Families laughed over dessert. Business meetings began and ended. A young server nervously carried her first tray across the dining room, while an older coworker quietly encouraged her with a reassuring smile. Claire watched the scene with peaceful contentment. "Nothing in this restaurant has really changed," she said. Ethan followed her gaze. "Perhaps not." Then he smiled thoughtfully. "But I have." Claire stood as another guest politely raised a hand requesting assistance. "Duty calls." Ethan nodded. "As always." Before walking away, Claire looked back one last time. "Keep asking good questions, Mr. Caldwell." He smiled. Only if you promise to keep answering them whenever life gives us the chance. She laughed softly before returning to her work, disappearing once again into the graceful rhythm of the dining room where she belonged. Ethan remained seated for another minute, gently unfolding the napkin one final time before carefully placing it back inside his pocket. Outside, Manhattan continued racing toward tomorrow, but inside his heart one quiet lesson would always remain unchanged. Some people spend their lives searching for extraordinary places where remarkable individuals gather. Others discover, often much later than they wish, that extraordinary people have been standing quietly beside them all along, asking for nothing more than the simple courtesy of being truly seen. And perhaps that is the rarest language anyone will ever learn, because it is not written with ink, spoken with perfect pronunciation, or taught inside famous classrooms. It is written through humility, read with respect, and understood only by those willing to look beyond a uniform before judging the person wearing it.